Hi class! For this week's discussion post, I've chosen to dive into the world of carotid and aortic bodies, two essential players that are involved in monitoring our blood chemistries and helping our bodies adapt to changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide pressures and the varying pH levels that can occur. So let's get started. I'll start with where these bodies are located. So first, on the left-hand side of the screen here, we have a drawing that I included of the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies. Here we have our heart, we have our aortic arch, our descending aorta, the right subclavian artery, the right common carotid artery, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery. And then here for the carotid bodies where the external and internal carotid arteries come together to form the carotid artery, this is where these chemoreceptors are located on either side. And then for the aortic body, at the very top of the aortic arch is where the aortic body is located. From the first slide, any changes in pressure of oxygen, changes in pressure in CO2, and then changes in pH are what these receptors, more specifically these peripheral receptors, are detecting in our blood. So what happens when we have these changes in oxygen, changes in pH, and changes in carbon dioxide? Well, in these chemoreceptor bodies, we have these cells called glomus cells. And in the instance where we have low oxygen or lower pH or high levels of CO2, we will activate this glomus cell. So this potassium channel here is sensitive to low levels of oxygen, and it is also sensitive to high levels of this proton ion. So in low pH, think we'll have more proton ions. And then also in situations when we have high carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide will dissociate into sodium bicarbonate and then an additional proton, and so once again we have higher levels of protons. And when this with this potassium channel is deactivated, it does not allow the potassium to exit the glomus cell, so we get a more positive charge on the inside of the cell. And when that happens, then these calcium gated channels, ion gated channels, will open up and allow calcium to flood in. And when calcium floods in, these green circles here, these are little basically vesicles of dopamine, the neurotransmitter dopamine. And when calcium floods into the cell, it activates these dopamine vesicles to fuse with the cell wall of the glomus cell to release the dopamine into this gap here to activate the nerve to send our signals to the breathing areas in our brain that we need to breathe more because we have high levels of high levels of CO2 or low levels of oxygen. Here, this nerve, if it is the carotid body C4, it will be the cranial nerve 9, and if it's the aortic bodies, it'll be cranial nerve 10. And then on the flip side, what happens when we have normal levels of oxygen or normal levels of CO2 or even higher levels of oxygen? Then in this case, this potassium channel, going back to the previous slide, will be available to transport potassium out of this glomus cell. And then this will result in the cell having an overall more negative charge because, once again, potassium is positively charged and the positive charge is leaving the cell. And therefore, let's go back to the calcium ion channel. This will not be activated, and therefore it cannot activate the dopamine to fuse with the glomus cell wall, and therefore if that can't happen, dopamine will not be released into this space here, and therefore it will not activate the either cranial nerve 9 or cranial nerve 10, and so we have these negative little dashes here, and therefore our breathing centers in our brain will not be activated to hyperventilate. Or in this case, sometimes it'll either be hypoventilate. And that is what happens when there is either normal levels or too high levels of oxygen and low levels of carbon dioxide. Let's conclude by talking a little bit about the clinical relevance of carotid and aortic bodies. In general, they help maintain the homeostasis of our breathing and keep our blood chemistries in check. But in certain medical conditions like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, or congestive heart failure, these chemoreceptors can become overstimulated. This overstimulation leads the increased respiratory drive, even if the changes in blood gases are relatively minor. This is why patients with COPD or heart failure have tachypnea and tachycardia. And that concludes today's small presentation on the carotid and aortic bodies. I will leave the class with this great song that I've been listening to all of this morning, and that is today's vibe. So I hope you learned something, and yeah, we'll see you on campus. Bye, everyone.